My name is Sam Carver. I'm 48 years old, and for 20 of those years, I worked for the United States Forest Service, most of that time in law enforcement. I've seen my share of strange things in the deep woods. I've tracked poachers in the dead of winter, dealt with people who'd gone mad from isolation, and pulled more than a few unfortunate souls out of ravines. I thought I was grounded in reality. I thought I understood the wilderness, its dangers, its rhythms. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness of Montana, and it cost me everything I thought I knew about the world. It was supposed to be our annual trip. My younger brother, Jake, owned a cabin deep in the Gallatin National Forest, miles from the nearest paved road. It was a solid, hand-built log structure his father-in-law had put up in the 70s. 2 stories, a stone fireplace, no electricity aside from a gas generator out back, and no running water besides a hand pump in the kitchen sink. It was our sanctuary, the one place we could truly disconnect. Jake was as comfortable in the woods as I was. He'd been a hunting guide for a decade before settling down to run a hardware store. We knew the land. This trip was different. Jake had invited his new friend from work, a guy named Brian. Brian was a city guy, born and raised in Seattle, and he'd brought along his girlfriend, Alyssa, and her friend, Megan. They were nice enough, but they were tourists in our world. They saw the mountains as a beautiful backdrop for photos, not as a living, breathing entity that demanded respect. Brian, especially, treated it all like a joke. He'd make loud, whooping calls to attract Bigfoot, and laughed when Jake and I told him to keep his voice down. He saw our quiet reverence for the place as old-fashioned foolishness. We arrived on a Thursday in late October. The aspens had already shed their leaves, leaving skeletal white branches against the dark green of the pines and firs. There was a chill in the air that promised an early snow. The air was clean and sharp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. The first day was perfect. We unpacked, got a fire roaring in the hearth, and Jake and I split wood while Brian tried to impress the girls by ineptly handling an axe. I took it from him before he lost a foot. He laughed it off, of course. Everything was a joke. That evening we sat on the porch, drinking beer as the sun went down. The sky turned a brilliant, bruised purple and orange. The forest settled into its nightly chorus, the hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a coyote pack, the gentle rustle of wind through the high branches. It was a symphony I knew by heart. It was the sound of peace. Alyssa and Megan were mesmerized by the sheer number of stars that popped into view as the last light faded. For a moment, even Brian was quiet, humbled by the immense, silent spectacle above us. It was the last moment of peace any of us would know. The first wrong thing happened around 10 o'clock that night. We were inside, playing cards by the light of a couple of kerosene lamps. The fire was crackling merrily. Suddenly, it went quiet. Not just in the cabin, but outside. The entire forest just stopped. The wind died. The coyotes went silent. The crickets, everything. It was a heavy, profound silence, the kind that presses in on your eardrums. I've experienced it before, usually when a large predator like a mountain lion or a bear is moving through an area. The whole food chain holds its breath. I glanced at Jake. He'd noticed it too. His hand paused over his cards, his head cocked slightly towards the window. Brian, oblivious, threw down a card and cheered. "Read 'em and weep, boys. Full house." His voice sounded unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Alyssa shushed him. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, though there was nothing to hear. That was the point. The absence of sound was a sound in itself. "Probably just a bear passing through," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. I didn't want to spook the others. But a bear didn't silence the wind. It was a weak explanation, and I knew it. Jake just nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the dark square of the window. He folded his hand. The game was over. The mood had shifted, curdled by that unnatural stillness. We sat there for another 10 minutes, listening to nothing but the fire and our own breathing. Then, as suddenly as it stopped, the sound returned. A soft breeze picked up, and a lone coyote howled far away. The spell was broken, but a seed of unease had been planted. We turned in for the night a little while later. Jake and I took the bunks in the downstairs bedroom, while the other three went up to the loft. I lay there for a long time, listening. The sounds were normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a primal instinct, the kind that kept your ancestors alive. I felt it before when tracking animals, but this was different. This felt intelligent, malign. I eventually drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. I was woken up by a sound. It was deep and rhythmic, coming from somewhere out in the woods. Thump, thump, thump. It was slow, deliberate. My first thought was someone chopping wood, but it was the middle of the night, and the sound was wrong. It didn't have the sharp crack of an axe splitting a log. It was a dull, heavy impact, like a giant hitting a tree with a sledgehammer wrapped in canvas. I sat up, straining to hear. It continued for about a minute, then stopped. I looked over at Jake's bunk. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I could see he was awake, too, sitting up and listening just as I was. The next morning, the unease of the night felt foolish in the bright, cold sunlight. Brian was back to his usual self, making pancakes and loudly recounting a story about a bar fight. Alyssa and Megan seemed to have forgotten the strange silence. Only Jake and I carried the night with us. After breakfast, he pulled me aside while we were getting our rifles from the lockbox. "You hear that last night?" he asked in a low voice. "The knocking?" I replied. He nodded. "Sounded like it came from the North Ridge." I agreed. "What do you think? Moose rubbing its antlers?" It was another weak explanation. A moose would make a scraping, grinding sound, not that clean, percussive thud. "Maybe," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Let's take a walk up that way, see if we can find any sign." We told the others we were going to do some scouting for deer, and left them at the cabin. The air was crisp, and our boots crunched on the frosted pine needles covering the forest floor. We walked in silence for a while, both of us scanning the trees, our senses on high alert. The forest felt different today. The birds were quiet. There were no squirrel tracks, no deer scat. It felt empty, sterile. We found the tracks about half a mile from the cabin, near the base of the North Ridge. They stopped us dead. I've seen thousands of animal tracks in my career. Bear, elk, moose, wolf, cougar. These were none of those. They were huge, for one thing, at least 16 inches long. They were bipedal, one footfall in front of the other, like a man's. But they weren't human. The shape was wrong. It was elongated, with 3 large clawed toes at the front and a smaller backward-facing one at the side, almost like a bird's foot, but massive and heavy. The stride was immense, a good 8 feet between steps. Whatever made these tracks was impossibly tall and moved with an unnatural gait. "What in God's name?" Jake whispered, crouching down to get a closer look. He didn't touch it. I knelt beside him, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. The print was deep, sunk a good 4 inches into the firm soil. The thing that made it had to be incredibly heavy. We followed the track line for a few 100 yards. It moved in a straight line, up the steep ridge, not deviating for fallen logs or thick underbrush. It just went over them. There was a chilling purposefulness to it. Then we found the deer. It was a large doe, or what was left of her. She'd been torn apart. Not eaten, just disassembled. The scene was grotesque. One leg was lodged high in the branches of a pine tree, 20 feet off the ground. The head was missing entirely. The torso was ripped open, the organs pulled out and laid carefully in a spiral on the ground. It was a ritualistic display of violence, something no predator I've ever known would do. A bear would have cached the carcass. A wolf pack would have devoured it. A cougar would have dragged it off. This was something else. This was a statement. The smell of blood was thick in the air, but there were no flies. No scavengers. Not even a raven had come to investigate. It was as if every living creature in the forest knew to stay away from this place. Jake and I looked at each other. The color had drained from his face. For the first time since we were kids, I saw real fear in my brother's eyes. "Sam," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "we need to go. We need to get them and leave." I didn't argue. Every instinct in my body was screaming the same thing. We turned and headed back to the cabin, moving quickly, constantly looking over our shoulders. The woods no longer felt like home. They felt alien, hostile. The familiar trees now seemed to form menacing shapes in our peripheral vision. Every snap of a twig made us jump. We were prey. We knew it. When we got back, Brian was on the porch, trying to teach Megan how to use the rifle. He was being careless, swinging the muzzle around. I saw red. I stormed up the steps, snatched the rifle out of his hands, and engaged the safety. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I snarled. "Never point a weapon at anything you don't intend to shoot." He put his hands up in mock surrender. "Whoa, easy there, Sergeant Rock. Just having a little fun." Fun. He thought this was fun. "There's nothing fun about it, Brian," Jake said, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "We're leaving, now. Everybody pack your things." That, of course, set off a storm of questions. "Leaving? Why? We just got here," Alyssa protested. Megan looked confused. Brian just looked annoyed. "Did you two get spooked by a squirrel?" He laughed. "We found something," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Something bad. A big predator in the area. It isn't safe." "A bear?" Alyssa asked, her eyes wide. "Bigger than a bear," Jake said grimly. "Just pack. We're not discussing it." But Brian wouldn't let it go. He wanted to see. He wanted proof. He accused us of trying to scare them, of making it up. The more we insisted, the more he dug his heels in. It was a power play for him, a way to show the girls he wasn't intimidated by us backwoods hicks. The argument got heated. Jake was losing his patience, and I was on the verge of physically throwing Brian in his car. Finally, I gave in. It was a mistake, a fatal mistake. "Fine," I said, my voice dangerously low. "You want to see? I'll show you. But you stay right behind me. You don't say a word, and you do exactly as I say. Understood?" He smirked, victorious. Jake tried to object, but I shook my head. Maybe seeing it would be the only way to get through to him. I left the girls at the cabin with strict instructions to lock the doors and not come out for any reason, and the three of us headed back towards the ridge. I led the way, rifle at the ready. Jake was behind me, his shotgun held loosely at his side. Brian trailed behind us, still treating it like an adventure. The forest was even quieter now, if that was possible. The air was heavy, stagnant. As we got closer to the kill site, the coppery tang of blood hit us again. Brian's joking demeanor finally faltered. "Whoa, what is that smell?" That's what we want to show you, I said, not looking back. We came into the small clearing. The doe was still there, untouched. Brian stopped. He stared at the grisly scene, at the leg in the tree, the spiral of organs. The color drained from his face. He made a gagging sound and stumbled back against a tree. What did that? He stammered. We don't know, Jake said, and we don't want to find out. Just as he said that, a low growl echoed through the trees. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a wolf. It was deeper, a guttural, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It came from all around us at once. We were surrounded. Back to the cabin, I hissed. Move, don't run. We started backing away slowly, rifles raised. Brian was frozen, his eyes wide with terror. Jake had to grab his arm and physically pull him along. The growling got louder, closer. Then we heard movement. Something massive was paralleling us in the trees, just out of sight. We could hear the heavy footfalls, the cracking of thick branches as it moved with impossible speed. We made it back to the clearing of the cabin and scrambled inside, bolting the heavy oak door behind us. The girls were huddled by the fireplace, their faces pale. "What was that sound?" Megan cried. "Get away from the windows," I ordered, my voice shaking slightly. I couldn't help it. I went to the front window and peered through a crack in the heavy wooden shutters. I could see nothing but the trees. But it was out there. I could feel it. The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery streaks. Darkness was a cloak for whatever was hunting us. The temperature dropped. A storm was rolling in. The wind began to pick up, rattling the cabin. The five of us sat in the main room, armed with 2 rifles, a shotgun, and the axe Brian had been playing with earlier. The kerosene lamps cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, turning the familiar space into a cavern of fear. No one spoke. We just listened. For hours, there was nothing but the sound of the rising wind and the spatter of rain against the roof. Brian was a changed man. His bravado was gone, replaced by a twitchy, silent terror. He just sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, clutching the axe. Alyssa was trying to comfort him, but she was trembling too. Around 9 o'clock, the generator outside sputtered, then died. The single electric bulb in the ceiling flickered out, plunging us into the dim, flickering world of the lamps. "It must be out of gas," Jake said, but we both knew that wasn't it. I had filled it myself that afternoon. It should have run all night. Something had stopped it. Then came the first sound. A soft, scraping noise from the back of the cabin. It sounded like a branch rubbing against the logs, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Jake and I exchanged a look. He motioned for me to stay put and crept towards the back room, shotgun in hand. He was gone for a minute that felt like an hour. When he returned, his face was ashen. "The shutter on the kitchen window," he whispered. "It's been torn off." A collective gasp went through the room. The windows were small, but a determined animal could get through. Before we could process that, a new sound started. The front doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. We watched in horrified silence as the brass knob twisted back and forth, testing the lock. This was the moment that broke Brian. He let out a strangled sob. "It's trying to get in. It knows how to use a door." His panic was infectious. Megan started to cry, her sobs sharp and hysterical. "Shut up," I hissed, my voice harsher than I intended. "Be quiet. It wants you to panic." The rattling stopped. Silence descended again, made heavier by the sound of Megan's muffled crying. Then came the voice. It was a distorted, gurgling whisper coming from just outside the front door. It sounded like it was trying to imitate a human voice, but getting it horribly wrong. It was Brian's voice. "Help me," it rasped. "It's got me. Let me in." Brian's head snapped up. For a second, a flicker of insane hope crossed his face. Alyssa grabbed his arm. "Brian, no, that's not you." The voice whispered again, closer this time, right against the wood of the door. "So cold, please." That was it. The psychological warfare was too much. The thing outside wasn't just a predator, it was a sadist. It was enjoying this. The sheer wrongness of it all, the tracks, the slaughtered deer, the mimicry, pushed me past fear and into a cold, focused rage. "Jake," I said, my voice steady, "get the table. We barricade this door, now." We dragged the heavy oak dining table and wedged it against the door. We piled chairs on top of it. As we worked, a tremendous impact shook the entire cabin, nearly knocking us off our feet. It sounded like a car had hit the house. A deep, splintering crack echoed from the front wall. It had thrown itself against the cabin. It did it again, and again. The whole structure groaned under the assault. Dust and splinters rained down from the ceiling. A storm broke outside in full force. Rain lashed against the cabin, and wind howled through the pines. A brilliant flash of lightning lit up the room, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder. In that brief, stark illumination, I saw its silhouette through the small gap in the front window shutters. It was huge, standing on the porch, easily 8 feet tall. It was hunched, with impossibly broad shoulders and long, spindly arms that hung almost to its knees. The head was long and narrow, like a wolf's. It was there for only a second. A hellish tableau burned onto my retinas, and then the darkness swallowed it again. The creature, enraged by the barricaded door, moved around the cabin, testing the walls. We could hear its heavy footsteps on the porch, the scrape of claws against the logs. It was looking for a weak point. It found one. A loud splintering sound came from above us. The loft. Jake and I looked up at the ceiling in unison. "The small window," he breathed. It was a tiny window, barely 2 feet square, but it was high up, and we hadn't thought to barricade it. We heard a scratching, tearing sound as it began to rip at the logs around the window frame. This thing had the strength to tear apart a log cabin with its bare hands. Panic erupted. Alyssa was screaming. Brian finally snapped. He'd been sitting there, catatonic, but now he jumped to his feet, the axe in his hand. "I'm not dying in here," he yelled, his eyes wild. He made a mad dash for the door. "Brian, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. He threw the chairs off the table and started pulling it away from the door. He was fueled by pure terror. Before Jake or I could stop him, he'd unbolted the door and thrown it open, screaming a defiant, insane roar into the stormy night. He took one step out onto the porch. The thing was waiting. It had been a feint. The noise in the loft was a diversion to draw our attention. From the darkness of the porch, a long black arm shot out and grabbed Brian by the throat. We saw it clearly in the lamplight spilling from the doorway. It was covered in coarse, dark fur, and the hand was disturbingly human-like, but with thick black talons instead of nails. Brian made a choked, gurgling sound as he was lifted off his feet. There was a sickening crunch, and his body went limp. The creature dropped him and stepped into the doorway, filling the frame. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was even bigger up close. Its fur was matted with rain and blood. Its legs were digitigrade, like a dog's, but they bent the wrong way, giving it a horrifying, unnatural stance. Its chest was massive, a barrel of muscle, but its waist was thin. But the head was the worst part. It was a long, lupine skull, but the eyes weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, glowing with a malevolent yellow light. Saliva dripped from its long jaws, which were filled with needle-like teeth. It took a step inside. For a moment, we were all frozen. Then the spell broke. Jake opened fire with the shotgun. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The buckshot hit the creature square in the chest, staggering it. It roared, a sound of pure fury and pain that shook the very foundations of the cabin. It wasn't the roar of an animal. It had a grating, metallic quality to it, like metal tearing. It lunged forward, ignoring the wound. It swiped at Jake, a blur of motion. The claws caught him across the chest and shoulder, tearing through his jacket and shirt like paper. He was thrown across the room, hitting the stone fireplace with a sickening thud. He slumped to the floor, motionless. Alyssa screamed and scrambled backward, trying to get away. The creature turned its attention to her. It moved with a terrifying, loping gait, its long arms reaching. I raised my rifle and fired. I put 2 rounds into its side. It flinched, but didn't stop. It was on Alyssa, grabbing her by the leg and dragging her towards it. Megan was a statue of pure terror, backed into a corner, her mouth open in a silent scream. My training kicked in, overriding the panic. All I could see were the glowing yellow eyes. A target. But I was out of clear shots. Alyssa was in the way. I dropped the rifle and grabbed the only other weapon I could reach, the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. The creature was leaning over Alyssa, its jaws open. I charged, screaming, and jammed the pointed end of the poker into its right eye with all my strength. There was a wet, popping sound. It shrieked, a high-pitched, piercing sound that was 1,000 times worse than the roar. It reared up, clutching its face, and its blood, thick and black, rained down on me. It had dropped Alyssa. It thrashed wildly, blindly, its claws gouging deep furrows in the floor and walls. This was our chance. "Go!" I yelled. "Get to the truck, now!" I grabbed Alyssa, who was sobbing hysterically, and pushed her towards the open door. I looked back at Megan. She was still frozen, her eyes locked on the writhing monster. I ran to her, grabbed her arm, and literally dragged her out of the cabin and into the lashing rain. Outside, the world was chaos. Wind, rain, and the horrifying screams of the wounded creature behind us. I shoved the 2 women towards Jake's old Ford truck, parked about 30 yards away. "Get in!" I screamed over the storm. I turned back for Jake. He was stirring, trying to push himself up. I ran back inside, heedless of the thrashing monster, and hauled him to his feet. His arm was hanging at a weird angle, clearly broken, and blood was soaking the front of his shirt. "I can make it," he gasped, leaning on me heavily. We stumbled out onto the porch together. The creature was recovering. It was on its feet, its one good eye fixing on us with an expression of pure, fathomless hatred. It let out another rumbling growl and started towards us. We didn't have time. We half ran, half fell our way to the truck. I threw Jake into the passenger seat and scrambled behind the wheel. The girls were huddled in the back seat, screaming. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with rain and blood. The engine turned over once, twice, and then roared to life. I slammed the truck into reverse just as the creature reached us. It leaped, landing with a tremendous crash in the truck bed. The whole vehicle bucked like a wild horse. Its claws began tearing at the metal of the cab, trying to get through to us. A clawed hand punched through the back window, shattering the glass. Shards flew everywhere. Megan screamed as the claws raked the air, inches from her face. I stomped on the gas, fishtailing wildly in the mud. I was driving blind, careening backward down the narrow track. I saw a massive pine tree looming in the rearview mirror. An idea, born of desperation, flashed in my mind. I spun the wheel hard. The rear of the truck swung around and slammed into the tree with a deafening screech of tortured metal. The impact threw us all forward against our seatbelts. The creature was dislodged, thrown from the truck bed into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it was getting up. I jammed the truck into drive and floored it. We tore down that logging road, branches scraping the sides, the suspension bottoming out in the ruts. I didn't slow down. I drove like a madman, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between us and that cabin. No one said a word. The only sounds were the howling of the wind, the engine screaming, and the ragged, terrified gasps of our own breathing. We drove for what felt like an eternity, until we finally hit the blessed, solid asphalt of the main highway. Only then did I ease up on the accelerator. Only then did I allow myself to believe we might actually live. We drove straight to the sheriff's station in the next town over. We must have been a hell of a sight. We stumbled into the brightly lit office around 2 in the morning, covered in mud and blood, Jake clutching his shattered arm, the women incoherent with shock. I was the only one who could speak, and even then, my voice was a ragged croak. I tried to tell the deputy on duty what had happened. I tried to be calm, to be factual, to use the language of a law enforcement officer reporting a critical incident. He listened patiently, his face a mask of professional concern. But I saw the skepticism in his eyes. He saw 4 people in shock, Jake's obvious injuries, the state of our clothes. He saw trauma. But the story I was telling him was impossible. A monster, a thing from a nightmare. He got us medical attention. An ambulance came for Jake. A female officer sat with Alyssa and Megan, trying to get a coherent statement. I gave my own statement to the deputy, and then to the sheriff himself when he arrived. I told them everything. The silence, the tracks, the deer, the siege on the cabin, Brian and his horrific death. I described the creature in meticulous detail. They wrote it all down. They were polite, they were professional, and they didn't believe a word of it. Not the important parts, anyway. They sent a team up to the cabin the next day. A search and rescue team, a forensics unit, and a guy from Fish and Wildlife. I wasn't allowed to go with them. The official story came out a few days later. It was a tragic, but sadly not uncommon, incident. A large, unusually aggressive grizzly bear had attacked the cabin. Brian Johnson, it was determined, had foolishly confronted the animal and been killed. Alyssa Vance had died of injuries sustained during the attack. They found her body 100 yards from the cabin. The official cause of death was animal attack and exposure. My brother's injuries and my own were consistent with a panicked flight through the woods. The damage to the cabin and the truck, all attributable to a bear of exceptional size and strength. It was neat, it was tidy, it explained everything away. Our statements were attributed to mass hysteria, a psychological break brought on by a terrifying but entirely natural event. They found bear tracks, of course. The woods were full of them. They never mentioned the other tracks, the ones I had seen. They found Brian's body, or what was left of it. They said the damage was consistent with bear predation. They didn't mention the way the deer had been arranged. The case was closed. We were left alone with the truth. Megan had a complete nervous breakdown and spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility. She still can't talk about what happened. Alyssa's family buried their daughter, believing she was killed by a bear. Brian's parents blamed Jake and me for taking their son into a dangerous situation. Jake recovered physically, but his arm never healed right. He sold the cabin and the land for a fraction of what it was worth. We never spoke of that night again. We didn't have to. It's always there, a silent, monstrous presence in the room whenever we're together. About a month after the incident, I got a phone call. It was an old deputy from that county, a man on the verge of retirement. He asked to meet me for coffee. He told me he was the one who had found Alyssa's body. He sat across from me in that diner, his hands wrapped around a warm mug, and he looked me in the eye. "I read your statement," he said, his voice low. "All of it. The part about the tracks, the part about the voice." I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "I've been working this county for 35 years, he continued, staring into his coffee. "You see a lot. Every 5 or 10 years, something like this happens. Hikers go missing off a trail, and we find their gear ripped to shreds. A hunter vanishes, and we find a blood trail that just stops. The official report is always a bear or a mountain lion, or they just say the person was never found. But the locals, the old-timers, they have other names for it." He looked up at me again, his eyes full of a tired, sad wisdom. "Your story isn't the first one like it I've heard. It's just the first time anyone survived to tell it. I'm telling you this so you know you're not crazy, and I'm telling you to never, ever go back into those woods. Some places aren't meant for us. Some things are best left alone." He paid for the coffee and left, leaving me there with the cold, bitter validation I had so desperately needed, but which offered no comfort at all. So that's my story. It's been 3 years. I left my job. I couldn't be in the woods anymore. The place that had been my church, my sanctuary, was now just a place of shadows and fear. I moved to the city, a place I've always hated, but the noise of traffic and people helps drown out the memory of that unnatural silence. I still have nightmares. I see those glowing yellow eyes. I hear that gurgling, mimicking voice. I wake up smelling blood and wet fur. I know what's out there. I know that the world is not the safe, rational place we pretend it is. The maps have blank spaces, and they are blank for a reason. There are things sleeping in the dark places of the world, ancient and terrible things, and our modern world has forgotten they exist. But they haven't forgotten us. I'm telling you this because someone has to. The official reports will always be neat and tidy. They'll always find a bear or a madman to blame. But the truth is messy, and it has claws, and it whispers your name from the darkness. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, and the birds suddenly go silent, don't try to explain it away. Just turn around and run. Run and don't look back.